My name is Gabriella Stringer, and I am 20 years old. I came home for Thanksgiving break to a 2-word note stuck to the refrigerator. Watch Grandma. No please, no explanation. My mother had taken the relatives she still counted as family on a cruise, and on the kitchen floor sat the tin box where my grandmother had hidden 24 years of diner tips and savings, cracked open, empty. My grandmother didn't cry. She looked at me, clear-eyed, and said, "Get my apron, Gabriella." What my family never understood was that they had left the wrong woman behind. 3 days later, my mother was the one on the floor. Let me take you back to how 2 words on a note started all of it. To understand the note, you have to understand the diner. My grandmother, Adeline Brennan, opened Brennan's Corner in 1994 on a corner lot in Belhaven, Ohio. Back when the road out front was 2 lanes and the fields behind it were open. By the time I was old enough to understand what a deed was, she owned the building and the corner lot outright. She knew every regular's order and most of their sorrows. She poured coffee at funerals and paid for meals when men lost jobs and pretended she'd forgotten to charge them. I grew up in that diner, not near it, in it. My parents split when I was 7. My father moved to another state and turned into a birthday card that stopped coming. My mother, Nicole, decided that being someone's mother was a phase she'd already outgrown. So my grandmother took me. I did my homework in the corner booth under the pie case. I learned fractions by cutting pies into sixths. I fell asleep to the sound of the dishwasher and the low hum of Rosalind, the waitress, counting her tips. My grandmother started the tin box the year my grandfather died. That was 2001. His name was Emmett. After his funeral, she told me she never wanted to be caught empty again. Not helpless, not dependent, not waiting on anyone. So every good shift, she folded away tips and spare cash after bills and slid them into a coffee tin behind the flour. 24 years. She was saving for herself, for once. She used to touch the lid and say, "This is my someday." She told me my grandfather had taught her the difference between what a place is worth and what it will sell for, and that most people only ever learn the selling half. I didn't know yet how much that one sentence would come to matter. My mother knew about the tin. Everyone in the family knew. But as long as my grandmother stood behind that counter every morning, it still felt like something no one would dare touch. Here is what my mother did in those years. She called when she needed something, a loan she didn't repay, a place to stay between boyfriends, a favor. She never came to my school things. When I got into college on a scholarship for a communications program, she said, "So you're going to school to play on the internet." My grandmother squeezed my hand under the table and said nothing, because she'd taught me that silence can be its own answer. I remember the night I told them about the scholarship. I'd practiced it in the car on the way over. The exact words, the right amount of not too proud. I set the letter on the table at dinner, and for 1 second, I let myself believe it might land the way good news lands in other people's families. My grandmother read it twice and pressed her hand flat over it like it was something she wanted to keep warm. My mother read one line, slid it back across the table, and asked if there was any pie left. That was the whole moment, a week of rehearsal, gone in the time it took her to look for dessert. Later, at the sink, my grandmother told me the letter was going up on the wall of the diner, right by the register, where every single person in town would have to look at it while they paid. It hung there for 3 years. My mother never mentioned it again. The calls came the way weather comes, regular and only from one direction. She needed a few $100s for a deposit. She needed a place to land for a month that turned into 3. She needed me to smooth something over with a landlord, a boyfriend, a bill collector. She never asked how school was going. She never asked how I was. The only time my name came out warm in her mouth was when it was fastened to something she wanted, and I'd learned, the way you learn a language you were born inside, to hear the little shift in her voice that meant a favor was coming before she'd even finished saying hello. I want you to understand, none of this was loud. There was no single terrible night. It was 1,000 small subtractions, and a subtraction doesn't leave a mark you can point to. It just leaves you lighter than you should be. Then, in the spring of 2025, my grandmother had a small fall in the kitchen, a slick floor, a bruised hip, nothing that didn't heal. But my mother saw an opening. Within a month, she was telling relatives that Mom's slipping, that Mom shouldn't be handling money, that someone responsible should help manage things, and that maybe it was time to get a doctor to put that in writing. My mother had never managed a checkbook of her own without disaster, but the story was useful. A confused old woman is easier to move around than a sharp one. I heard the story and believed my grandmother was fine because she was. What I didn't understand yet was that a story doesn't have to be true to be a plan. That was the shape of things on Monday, November 24th, when I drove home and found the house dark, the family gone, and 2 words waiting for me on the fridge. The tin box was on the kitchen floor, not behind the flour where it belonged. The lid had been pried, not opened, pried with something metal, the way you open a thing that isn't yours. It was empty. 24 years, and I could have held all of it in the crook of one arm if there'd been anything left to hold. My grandmother was sitting in the front room in the dark. She hadn't turned on a lamp. She wasn't crying. She was just sitting very straight in her chair, the way she sits when she's deciding something. "They took it for the cruise," she said, not guessing, not asking. "How much was in there?" $52,000. She said the number, the way you'd say a date you'll never forget. 24 years. I sat down across from her. I wanted to say something furious, and I didn't have anything big enough. My mother hadn't just taken money. She'd taken a woman's someday and spent it on a buffet at sea, and she'd left her daughter behind to babysit the person she'd robbed, with a note that treated my grandmother like a chore on a list. My grandmother looked at me then. Her eyes were completely clear, not lost, not old, present, in a way that made my skin prickle. "Get my apron, Gabriella," she said. I didn't understand. I asked her what she meant. "The diner's been closed for 4 months," she said. "We're going to open it for Thanksgiving, even if it's only 1 service." I told her it was impossible. The place was shut. Thanksgiving was 3 days away. They'd taken every dollar. And she looked at me with the smallest, driest smile I have ever seen on a human face, and she said, "Then we'd better hurry." That was the first night. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pried lid, but I kept coming back to her eyes and the way she'd said the word apron, like it was armor. The next morning, Tuesday, she was standing at the front door of Brennan's Corner at 7 a.m. with the key in her hand. Inside, it was worse than I remembered. 4 months of closed. Dust on the counter thick enough to write in. The air smelled like cold grease and old coffee. There was a yellow notice taped to the front window from the county. A re-inspection required after the long closure before anyone could legally serve food again. On the counter, a fan of unpaid bills, electric, gas. A past due notice with a shut-off date circled in red, Friday morning, just after the holiday. The clock over the pass had stopped at 4:40, whatever day the place had gone dark, and no one had ever come back to wind it. I walked the room the way you walk through a house after a flood. The pie case was empty and unplugged, a smear of old syrup dried black in one corner. The booths still had the little chips in the laminate I'd known by heart as a kid. My letter was gone from the wall by the register, Taken down, I guessed, when they closed up, though nobody had ever told me the place was closing at all. I found out my childhood home had shut its doors the same way I found out everything about my family. After the fact, if at all. I sat on a stool and did the math out loud because saying it made it real. No usable cash, the tin was gone, and the bills were unpaid. Overdue utilities with a shut-off date inside our window. A county notice on the glass. A kitchen that hadn't been cold-started in 4 months. And 72 hours until the one day of the year a diner is supposed to be too busy to breathe. I told her, gently, that even good restaurants take weeks to reopen. That people plan this for months. That we had nothing to plan with. My grandmother tied her apron behind her back, the blue one, faded almost gray at the strings, the same one from every memory I have of her, and looked around the ruined room like a general looking at ground she already owned. "Well," she said, "let's see what still works." Almost nothing worked. The walk-in freezer, not the cooler, thank God, had failed sometime in the closed months. When she opened it, the smell told the whole story. The compressor was dead, and the county notice on the window meant that even if we cleaned everything, we couldn't legally serve even a limited Thanksgiving plate until an inspector signed off. I said the thing I'd been swallowing since the night before. "Grandma, maybe we call someone. A lawyer. The police. They stole from you." She wiped a circle clean on the counter and set her hand flat on it. "We'll talk about lawyers," she said. "Right now I need a cook." That was when the bell over the door rang. A man stood in the doorway, heavy in the shoulders, gray stubble, a canvas coat. He looked at my grandmother the way you look at someone you've been afraid you'd never see again. His name was Wendell Poole. He'd cooked the grill at Brennan's Corner for 20 years before his knees retired him. My grandmother had given him a job once when no one else in town would, back when he was fresh out of a bad stretch and everyone knew it. He'd never forgotten. He walked past me, put his hand on the dead freezer, and said, "This is fixable, not the compressor, but we don't need the walk-in for 3 days if we buy smart and cook fast." "There's no money to buy anything," I said. Wendell looked at me, then at my grandmother, then at the empty room. "She fed this whole town for 30 years, he said. "Town's got a short memory, but it ain't that short." "Addie," he said. "Roz called me, said the note went up on the window." He said it plain, like it wasn't a favor, like it was just true. 30 years ago I came in here half a man," he said, not looking up from the freezer. "She put a spatula in my hand and didn't ask me a single question about where I'd been. You don't forget who does that for you." And then he pulled a battered notebook out of his coat and started writing a prep list as if we'd already decided. Turkeys, stock, what could be cooked to order without a walk-in, what we could hold cold in a borrowed cooler. We hadn't decided, but standing there, watching a 68-year-old man plan a menu on the strength of a debt he thought he still owed, I understood that the deciding had already happened without me, somewhere back in the dark front room the night before, and all that was left was to keep up. Then the freezer problem got worse. Once Wendell had it fully open, the smell cleared the room, and the answer was obvious. Everything inside was a loss, and the compressor was finished. No repair before Thanksgiving. No check to write for one anyway. Wendell said we'd have to buy fresh, daily, and cook like a field kitchen. Possible. Barely. The second was the phone. The county inspector's office called my grandmother's cell to schedule the re-inspection the notice required, and the only slot left before the holiday, a cancellation someone else had given up, was the next afternoon, Wednesday, 4 o'clock. One appointment, one inspector, One signature standing between us and a legal reopening. If we failed it, there was no second slot until December, and by December, the only thing anyone would remember was that the old woman had tried and couldn't. My grandmother wrote the time on the back of her hand in pen, the way she used to write orders when the ticket rail jammed. "Then we don't fail it," she said. That was the end of the first day, and here's what I understood as I locked the door that night. We didn't have a reopened diner yet. We had a dead freezer, a stack of red ink bills, a code notice, one volunteer cook, and one inspection slot standing between us and everything. And somewhere out on the ocean, my mother was ordering a second dessert. I went home and I sold things. I had a camera and a spare lens from my program. Decent equipment I'd bought used, one paycheck at a time, working the campus help desk. It was the one thing in my life that was entirely mine, that no one had given me and no one could take back. I posted both pieces online that night at prices low enough to sell by morning. A man met me in a grocery store parking lot at 7 a.m. and handed me an envelope of cash for the camera, and I handed him the bag. And I sat in my car for a minute afterward with my hands on the wheel, because it felt like handing over a version of myself I'd been saving up to become. Then I told myself the story I half believed, that I still had my phone, and my phone had a good camera, and a good camera in the hands of someone who knows what to point it at is worth more than the best gear pointed at nothing. I mostly believed it. Mostly was enough to drive on. The cash covered enough for the gas reconnection and a first real grocery run. It was nowhere near enough for a Thanksgiving. It was just enough to start, and starting, it turned out, was the only part I could do alone. Wednesday morning we cleaned, all of us. Wendell scrubbed the flat top down to bare steel. My grandmother ran the front like it was a shift, wiping, ordering, moving, 20 years younger in the apron than she'd looked in the dark front room. And around 9, after sending Wendell ahead the day before, Rosalind Pruitt walked in. Roz, the waitress from my childhood, 58 now, her hair grayer, her aim with a coffee pot unchanged. "I heard," she said, and that was all the greeting she gave. She tied on an apron of her own. Then she took out her phone, put on her reading glasses, and started working through a contact list that was really just the town's memory kept in one woman's hands. I listened to one side of a dozen calls. "It's Roz. Addie's opening back up for Thanksgiving. No, I'm not asking for money. I'm asking what you've got in your freezer you were never going to use." She knew who baked and who couldn't, who had a truck, who owed Addie a kindness from a decade back and had been waiting for a way to repay it. By noon, there was a folding table by the door, and it kept filling. A case of turkeys from the man who ran the meat counter, who told me flatly that Addie had comped his family's meals for a month the winter he got laid off, and he'd been carrying that around for 11 years, looking for the day to give it back. Potatoes by the sack, pie tins, a loaner refrigerator that took 4 men to walk in on a hand truck. An old woman who could barely see brought 24 jars of her own preserves and would not leave until my grandmother came out from the back to hold her hands. Nobody made a speech. People set things down, said, "Tell Addie we're glad," and left before anyone could count the kindness too closely. I filmed some of it quietly, not knowing yet what I'd do with it. I just knew I was watching something that most people go a whole life without seeing. A town deciding, without being asked, that one of its own was not going to be left on the floor. The inspector came at 4 on the dot. He was a compact, unsmiling man with a clipboard and a thermometer, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted his signature on a piece of paper. He didn't make small talk. He walked the lines slow. He checked the temperatures on the borrowed cooler and wrote something down. He ran a gloved finger along the steel Wendell had scrubbed down to a shine and wrote something else. He opened the dead walk-in, saw it was tagged out of service, and made a note. At the hand-washing sink, he ran the water a long time, testing the heat, and I watched my grandmother watch him, her face giving away nothing, her hand resting flat on the counter, the way it does when she's holding herself still on purpose. For one long minute after he finished, he just stood there, reading his own notes, and I stopped breathing. Then he clicked his pen, signed us off for limited service, tore off the yellow copy, and handed it to my grandmother. "Good to have you back, Adeline," he said, and left. We had passed by the width of a scrubbed countertop and a town that showed up. Wendell let out a breath that shook the pass. Roz sat down for the first time all day. I went into the walk-in cooler that still worked and let myself shake for exactly 30 seconds. And then I came back out because we still had a Thanksgiving to build and no time to feel anything all the way through. That should have been the hard part behind us. Instead, the bell over the door rang and a different kind of man walked in. He wore a coat that cost more than my car. He carried a leather folder. He looked around the diner the way a person looks at a room they've already decided to knock down. "I'm looking for Nicole Stringer," he said. "She told me she'd be handling things here." My grandmother set down her rag. "Nicole isn't here. I'm the owner. Who are you?" He introduced himself as Preston Hale from Halloran Ridge Development. He said the name like we should already know it, and when we didn't react, he opened the leather folder a little impatiently, the way a busy man does a small courtesy. "The corner lot," he said. "Nicole and I have been in conversation for a few months now. She indicated the family was ready to move forward on the sale, and that she had authority to represent your interests. I'm here for a preliminary walkthrough before the holiday, nothing formal yet, a look at the parcel, some notes." He glanced around at the old counter, the empty pie case, my grandmother in her faded apron, the donated turkeys stacked by the door, and his glance did the math out loud without a word. "The preliminary number was $825,000, he said. "A strong offer for a parcel this size, given where the corridor is headed. Frontage like this doesn't sit long. I assumed she'd walked you through it," he said. "A strong offer for a parcel this size, given where the corridor is headed. Frontage like this doesn't sit long. I assumed she'd walked you through it." The room went very quiet. Even Wendell stopped moving at the grill. I felt the floor of my understanding drop out because I'd spent 2 days furious about $52,000 in a coffee tin. And here was a stranger in an $800 coat standing in my grandmother's diner talking about $825,000 like it was already spent. The tin box wasn't the whole theft. The tin box was the distraction. My mother hadn't just emptied a savings tin and flown to the ocean. She had been quietly trying to sell the whole thing. The diner, the lot, the corner, the ground. I'd learned fractions on. Out from under a woman she'd told everyone was too confused to notice. And she'd left me a 2-word note to keep the old woman busy while the papers moved. I looked at my grandmother. She hadn't flinched. Not at the number, not at her daughter's name. Not at any of it. She'd known someone like him might walk through that door. Meredith had warned her the developer might start circling before the holiday. Mr. Hale must have read my face because he closed his folder. "I take it there's been a miscommunication," he said carefully. "There's been a great deal of communication," my grandmother said. "Just not from her to me. You can go, Mr. Hale. There's no sale." He hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't want to overstep, but if there's a question of who has authority to—" "There's no question," she said. Calm, flat, final. "Not one you'd win." He left. The bell over the door swung and went still. I turned to my grandmother, my hands shaking, and I asked her the only thing I could get out. "You knew he might come," I said. "You knew about the sale." She untied her apron slowly, folded it, and set it on the counter. "Sit down, Gabriella," she said. "It's time you knew what I've been doing." We closed the diner an hour early that night. She sat me in the corner booth, my booth, the one under the pie case, and she put a folder on the table between us. Not leather, manila, soft at the corners from being opened and closed. "Last spring, after the fall," she said, "your mother started telling people I wasn't right in the head. I let her. I wanted to see how far she'd take it." She opened the folder. "In June, I went to see a lawyer, Meredith Callahan. Good woman, younger than she looks." Inside the folder were documents. My grandmother turned them so I could read. "I put the diner and the lot into a trust," she said. "It protects the property for you, Gabriella. Not your mother, not the family. You." She tapped a second page. "I updated my will in the same week. Nicole is not in it. She hasn't been since the summer." A third page, on a doctor's letterhead. "And I asked Dr. Whitfield, the geriatrician, the one your mother wanted to use against me, to examine me and put in writing that I understood exactly what I was signing and why. So no one can ever stand up and say the old woman was confused." I couldn't speak. I read the pages twice. My name, over and over, my name, on the trust papers, for the only place I'd ever felt safe. Then something else caught up with me, and it hurt more than I expected. "You started this in June," I said. "You let me believe. All these months, you never told me." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the way she used to under it. "If I'd told you in June," she said, "you'd have carried it all summer. You'd have looked at your mother across the table at every dinner and known. I didn't want to put that on a 19-year-old girl who still hoped her mother might surprise her." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes did, just slightly. "I'm sorry. I did it to protect you. I see now it looked like I didn't trust you. It was the opposite." I sat with that for a while. I want to tell you I understood right away, that I hugged her and thanked her and felt only grateful. I didn't, not that night. Part of me was still stuck on the summer, on every dinner where I'd sat across from my mother trying to believe the best, while my grandmother sat beside me already holding the truth in a manila folder and choosing to carry it alone. "You could have told me," I said again, quieter. "I know." She didn't defend it a second time. She just let it be true, which is a thing almost no one in my family had ever done. When you're my age, you learn there's a difference between a secret you keep to protect yourself and one you keep to protect somebody else. I've watched your mother keep the first kind her whole life. I wasn't going to teach you she was right about which kind matters. And that was when I understood the important thing, the thing that took the anger's legs out from under it. I had spent my entire life being told I was the backup, the extra, the one who'd be fine, the one you leave a note for. And here was proof, in soft-cornered paper, that the one person who had actually raised me had been 3 moves ahead the whole time, and every single move she made ended in the same place. My name. Not because I was easy to hand things to, because I was the one she trusted to hold them. Her phone buzzed on the table, a text from Meredith Callahan. My grandmother turned it so I could see it. The trust had been signed in June. Meredith had recorded the deed that afternoon once the developer started circling. Filed with the county. Public. Done. "There," my grandmother said quietly. "Now it can't be undone." I should have felt only relief. Instead, I felt the floor tilt because I understood what recorded meant. It meant that somewhere out on the ocean, the moment my mother came back and reached for what she thought she could sell, she was going to close her hand on nothing, and she wasn't going to find out gently. She was going to find out in front of whoever was standing there. Wednesday night became the same scramble with a different feeling. because now I knew we weren't fighting to survive. We were building towards something, and I had a phone in my pocket, and telling stories is the one thing I actually know how to do. I filmed, not a speech, just the truth, plain. My grandmother's hands cracking eggs, the blue apron, Wendell at the grill, Roz calling the town. I filmed the empty tin box on the counter where she'd set it back, empty, but hers. And I said, in my own voice, over the top, my family emptied a 76-year-old woman's life savings and left her behind to go on a cruise. So she's reopening her diner. And on Thanksgiving, she's feeding anyone in this town who has nowhere to go for free. I sent it to Josephine Marsh before I lost my nerve. Josephine writes for the Bellhaven paper and the site that half the county actually reads. I'd met her once, covering a fair for a class. I didn't expect an answer. She called me within the hour after I sent photos of the note, the tin box, and the county notice. Is this real? She said. The tin box, the note, all of it? All of it, I said. I have the note. I have the box. I'm coming Thanksgiving morning, she said. Save me the corner booth. That night, Wednesday, the night before Thanksgiving, I let myself hope. And that was exactly when my cousin Brett showed up. Brett is my Aunt Deanna's son, 23, the kind of person who films himself being generous. He wasn't on the cruise. He'd been left behind as the local set of eyes, which meant left to report. He stood in the diner doorway with his phone already up, panning across the room, the turkeys, the pies, the town's borrowed refrigerator. Wow, he said. Grandma's really got you working, huh? Aunt Nicole's gonna want to see this. Then show her, I said. He did. 10 minutes after he left, my phone rang, and it was my mother's name on the screen, calling from a ship in the middle of the ocean, and I knew the quiet part of this was over. I put her on speaker so my grandmother could hear. Gabriella. My mother's voice came through tight and bright, the way it gets when she's decided she's the reasonable one. I have been getting the strangest messages. What are you doing to that diner? Reopening it, I said, for Grandma. That place is closed. It's been closed. It's not... Gabriella, you don't understand the finances, honey. There are things being handled. You're going to embarrass this family. You emptied her savings, I said. You left her a note, a pause with an ocean in it. Then the pivot I'd heard my whole life. I did what I did for this family. Your grandmother is not well. She has not been well for a long time, and I have been protecting her from making exactly the kind of scene you are making right now. So here is what's going to happen. You are going to shut it down tonight. We fly back, and we're home tomorrow evening. When I walk in, that diner will be dark, or I promise you, I will involve the county and a lawyer, and they will not be as gentle as I am about a young woman taking advantage of a confused elderly relative. I looked at my grandmother. She wasn't confused. She was sitting straighter than a woman half her age, listening to her daughter call her a liability across 2,000 miles of water. We'll be open tomorrow, I said. Come by. Bring whoever you want. I hung up before she could answer. My hand was steady, and that surprised me more than anything she'd said. Somewhere in the last 3 days, the part of me that used to brace at the sound of her voice had quietly stopped bracing. Then we got to work, because a threat with a deadline is just a clock, and clocks can be beaten. I called Meredith Callahan and asked if she could be at the diner the next evening with the trust papers and the doctor's letter, in case my mother made good on her threat. She said she'd try, and if she couldn't, she'd send scanned copies I could show in the room. I texted Josephine and told her why the family was flying home. She said that if the story was still moving, she'd stay. I told Wendell and Roz what was coming. Neither of them blinked. Wendell just said, "Then we'll feed whoever comes." Truth has a way of standing straighter in a full room. My grandmother spent the last of the evening on one thing, the sign. She'd ordered it months ago, she admitted, when she was signing everything else, a new sign for a reopening she'd always intended. It arrived that afternoon, wrapped, and she had Wendell lean it against the wall by the register, with the cloth still on it. She wouldn't let me look. "Tomorrow," she said, and turned off the light behind the counter. But she left the old sign lit, the tired red Brennans glowing out over the dark corner lot my mother had tried to sell. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I took the note out of my jacket pocket. "Watch Grandma," in my mother's rushed hand, the ink pressed hard the way you write when you're already halfway out the door. 2 words for 24 years of a woman's life. I turned it over and over, and somewhere in that long dark hour I stopped being afraid of the next day, because I finally understood what it was going to be. By tomorrow night, enough of the town was going to be watching my grandmother, and it was going to mean the exact opposite of what my mother had scrawled. Thanksgiving came gray and cold and perfect. We opened the doors at 11. I have tried many times to describe what the next few hours felt like, and I always fall short, so I'll just tell you what happened. People came. First, the regulars, the ones Roz had called, standing on the sidewalk at 10:45 in their coats. Then, the people the regulars had told. Then, people none of us knew at all. A man who'd buried his wife in October and hadn't cooked a meal for himself since, who sat at the counter and ate slowly and didn't say much and stayed 3 hours because leaving meant going back to a quiet house. A young mother with 2 kids and no family within 1,000 miles, who tried to pay and cried when Roz folded her hand shut around her own money. 3 college students who couldn't afford to fly home for the holiday and had been planning to split a frozen pizza. An older couple who told me, almost embarrassed, that they hadn't been invited anywhere in years and had stopped expecting to be, and had come only because a stranger's video said everyone was welcome. When we set a place for them, the woman put her napkin over her face and her husband put his hand on her back, and neither of them said a word. Wendell ran the grill until his shirt was soaked through, and he grinned the entire time, calling out tickets in a voice I remembered from being 7 years old. Roz never sat down once, and my grandmother worked the room in her blue apron, remembering names she hadn't said in years, touching shoulders, refilling coffee before the cup was empty, more alive than I had seen her in a decade. Nobody in that room would have believed she was the confused old woman a story had made her out to be. The story died in there, quietly, plate by plate. Josephine Marsh arrived at noon and stayed 4 hours. She didn't rush anyone. She sat in booths and listened. She talked to the widower and the young mother and the couple who'd stopped expecting invitations. At one point, she picked up the empty tin box from the counter, turned it over in her hands, read the dents in it, and got very quiet, and I knew she'd understood the whole thing without my having to explain it. And I filmed. The line out the door and around the corner, the full booths, the free plates, going out one after another. My grandmother laughing at something Wendell said. The woman crying into her mashed potatoes because, for the first time in longer than she'd admit, someone had set a place at the table with her name on it. I posted the video mid-morning, before the rush, and then I got too busy to look at my phone. When I finally checked it around 2, it had crossed 100,000 views, and my hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the tray I was carrying. By 4, Josephine's piece went up. Real reporting. Careful and fair. The note and the box, and the 24 years, all laid out plainly. No exaggeration needed, because the truth was already more than enough. That was the one that jumped the fence. It went from our county to the state to places I'd never been, shared by people who'd never set foot in Ohio, who just knew what it felt like to be the one left behind with the note. By evening, between the video, Josephine's piece, and every local page that had picked it up, the story had crossed 1.8 million views and was still climbing. And the little donation jar Roz had set by the register, almost as a joke, a coffee can, fittingly, had $11,200 in it. Not sales, just people giving back. Tens and twenties and folded fives pushed in by a town that remembered exactly what my grandmother had done for them across 31 years and had just been waiting for a way to do something back. I want to be honest about what that money was and wasn't. It wasn't the tin box. $52,000 was still gone, spent at sea. $11,200 didn't replace it. But that was never the point, and it was never the win. The win was standing in the room, a full house, a waiting list of people asking about catering, 3 local businesses asking about the space, a reporter's story traveling the country, and a corner lot that the developers had wanted quietly, cheaply, in the dark, now known by name to half the state. My grandmother hadn't just reopened a diner. She'd made herself impossible to erase, and she'd done it in the open, where no one could ever pry it loose again. Around 5, in a lull, she and I stood behind the counter and looked at the room. She was breathing hard, happy tired, her hand flat on the steel. "Your grandfather used to say a thing," she said. "He said a place is worth what it does for people, not what it sells for." She looked at me. "Your mother only ever learned the second half of that sentence." Then the bell over the door rang, and the room's noise dipped, the way a room dips when something walks in that doesn't belong. My family had come home. My mother stood in the doorway, still in her travel clothes, a rolling suitcase behind her, my Aunt Deanna at her shoulder, Brett half hidden behind them with his phone already up. My mother had clearly expected a dark diner. Instead, she found 100 people in her mother's restaurant, a news photographer by the pie case, and a brand new sign leaned against the wall by the register, its cloth cover not yet hung. A sign that read, "Brennan's Corner," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "Adeline and Gabriella." She saw the crowd first, then the camera, then the sign, and I watched her try to fit those 3 things into the story she'd flown home with and fail. She recovered the way she always recovers, by getting loud. "What is going on here?" she said, not a question, walking in. "Gabriella, Mom, this is not okay. This woman is not well." She said it to the room, to the strangers, gesturing at my grandmother. "I don't know what my daughter has told all of you, but my mother is not capable of making these decisions, and this girl is taking advantage of—" "Mrs. Stringer?" The voice came from the corner booth. A woman I hadn't met in person stood up, younger than she'd sounded on the phone, in a plain, dark coat, holding a slim folder. Meredith Callahan. My grandmother had asked her to come, and she'd come on Thanksgiving. "I'm Adeline's attorney," she said, calm, carrying. "I think you'll want to see these before you continue." Meredith laid the documents on the counter, one by one, facing my mother. "Capacity evaluation from Dr. Whitfield," she said. "Signed in June. Your mother was found competent." She set down the second page. The trust documents, the diner and corner lot were protected in June, and the deed was recorded with the county yesterday afternoon. Then the third. Correspondence with Halloran Ridge. You discussed a sale of property you did not own and had no legal authority to sell. My mother looked at the 3 pages, then at my grandmother, then finally at me. And I saw the exact moment the last piece dropped into place, the moment she understood that the diner and the lot weren't hers to take or sell or inherit, that they had been protected for me since June, that she'd flown home to collect on something she'd lost months ago and never knew it. "Who gets it?" she said. Her voice had gone strange and small. "Who did she leave it to?" The whole room was silent now. Even Wendell had come out from the grill, wiping his hands, watching. "Me," I said. I didn't shout it. I didn't have to. I said it the way my grandmother says things, flat and quiet and true, and it landed in that silent room like the last card turned over on a table. Somewhere behind me, a fork stopped scraping a plate. Nobody in that diner moved. The girl who played on the internet, the granddaughter you leave a note for, was the person the ground had been protected for since June, and everyone in the room understood it in the same second my mother did. My grandmother stepped forward then. She looked at her daughter across the counter she'd stood behind for 31 years, and she said the thing I will hear for the rest of my life. "You didn't lose a diner, Nicole," she said. "You lost the only person who was still willing to feed you." My mother swayed, reached for a stool, missed it, and sat hard on the floor. Not dramatically, not for show, but the way a person sits down when the story they've been standing on is pulled out from under them all at once. There she was, on the floor of the diner she'd tried to sell, in front of 100 strangers and a photographer's lens, with nothing reasonable left to say. 3 days after 2 words on a note, my mother was the one on the floor. We closed early that night, not because of her, because the food ran out, which is the best reason a diner ever closes. The strangers left full. Josephine left with her story. Wendell hung the new sign before he went home, standing on a step stool his knees hated, and when the cloth came off and Brennan's corner lit up over the lot, a few people still on the sidewalk actually clapped. My mother didn't leave. She sat in the corner booth, my booth, while we cleaned, and when the last stranger was gone, she started talking. This was the part that didn't happen for the cameras. This was the part that was just ours. "I want you to understand," she said. "I was drowning, Gabriella. The debt, you have no idea. I was going to lose everything, and your grandmother has all this money just sitting in a building, an old woman who doesn't need it anymore." Her eyes were wet now, and I believe the tears were real, which somehow didn't help. "It was one mistake, one bad decision under pressure. You're my daughter. You're supposed to understand." I sat down across from her. I was very tired and very calm, and I finally understood the difference my grandmother had spent my whole life teaching me without naming it. "It wasn't one mistake," I said. "A mistake is one thing, one choice. This was months of choices." I laid them out, not loudly, just in order, the way Meredith had laid out her pages. "You told people she was confused when she wasn't. You tried to build a case against your own mother. You opened her coffee tin with a tool. You talked to a developer about land that wasn't yours. You spent her savings at sea. And then you left me a note like she was an appliance you forgot to turn off." She started to cry harder, and I want to tell you it moved me, because she's my mother and some wiring in me will always answer to that. But I'd watched her cry before, at exactly the moments crying was useful, and I'd learned the difference between grief and being caught. "I was going to pay it back," she said. "Once everything settled, I was going to make it right." And I realized she still didn't understand what she'd taken. She thought this was about money, about $52,000 or $825,000, a debt with a number she could someday clear. It was never about the number. It was about a woman who spent 31 years feeding a town and a daughter who looked at all of it and saw only something to sell. My mother turned to my aunt, looking for the ally she'd always had. And here is the thing I didn't expect. Deanna, who had gone on the cruise, who had said nothing all night, looked at the floor and said very quietly, She's been planning the sale since the fall, Gabriella. We knew. I knew. She wouldn't meet my mother's eyes. I'm sorry. I should have said something in the fall. It was true, and it was late, and it changed nothing about the last 4 months. But my grandmother had taught me that a true thing, said too late, is still worth more than a lie said on time. So I let my aunt have it, and I didn't thank her for it, because it wasn't a gift. I told my mother the only thing left to tell her. Grandma's going to live with me now, I said. The diner's going to run. You're not going to manage anything, because there's nothing of hers left for you to manage. If you want to see her, you come through the front door during business hours, and you order like everybody else, and you pay. I stood up. That's not me cutting you off. That's just what a door is. It opens for people who knock. My mother left in silence. Deanna went after her. Brett had stopped filming a while before, which was the smartest thing he did all night. My grandmother turned off the light behind the counter, but she left the new sign lit, Brennan's Corner, glowing white and steady over the dark lot my mother had tried to sell. That was late November. I'm telling you this in the weeks after, and I can tell you how it settled, because it did settle. The diner runs. It runs well, better than it did before, if I'm honest, because a story travels and people drive out from the city now to sit in a booth where a town showed up for an old woman. Wendell cooks 3 days a week on the days his knees allow. Roz runs the front like she never stopped. I'm doing the thing my mother once called playing on the internet, except now it fills the booths, and it turns out that was always a real job. She just didn't want it to be a real job for me. I finished the semester remotely and arranged my spring classes around the diner because for the first time, the thing I was studying had somewhere real to go. My grandmother still wears the blue apron most mornings, but now she hangs a second one beside it for me. Halloran Ridge came back around, more polite this time, and my grandmother agreed to talk, but on her terms, about leasing a piece of the corridor nearby on paper with Meredith in the room, and not 1 inch of the corner lot for sale. My grandmother sees a physical therapist for the hip and a counselor for the rest of it, and so do I, because it turns out you can win and still have somewhere in you that needs tending. We took an actual weekend off, the two of us, the first vacation of my life that wasn't someone else's. My mother sent one text 2 weeks ago. It said she was sorry and that she hoped we could move forward. I read it. I didn't delete it. I didn't answer it yet either. My grandmother says an apology is a door too. It opens for the person who's ready to walk through it and do the work on the other side, not for the person who's only tired of standing in the cold. I'll answer it when I mean the answer. That's not cruelty. That's just the truth, taking the time it needs. The tin box sits on a shelf behind the register now, empty. She never put money back in it. She says she doesn't need to anymore. That someday you build in the open, where a whole town can see it, can't be pried loose in the dark. Next to the box, in a plain frame, is the note. Watch, Grandma. My mother's handwriting, 2 words, meant as a chore. People ask about the frame sometimes. My grandmother tells them the truth. She says her family left her that note so a girl would babysit an old woman while they spent her life savings. And then she nods at the full room, the strangers who became regulars, the whole town that drives out to sit at her counter, and she says, "Well, they got their wish. Everybody watches Grandma now." I used to think I needed my family to tell me I was worth something, that if I just waited, if I was good enough and quiet enough and useful enough, they'd finally look up and see me. They never did. It took a pried open tin and an empty house to teach me that the seeing was never coming, and that I didn't need it to stand up straight. I don't need them to define what I'm worth. I have a diner, a grandmother, a town, and a place in the future no one can sign away. I built the rest myself, out of the thing they threw away. If you've ever been the one left behind with the note, the one they were sure would just take it, the one they never bothered to really see, I'd like to know what you built out of what they left you. Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I promise you, whatever it was, it counted.